In a house built to outlast scandal, one small document did something far more dangerous than leak. It survived, long enough to be listed twice and then erased as if it never existed. This video is Astor Mansion, the document removed from the records and why it matters. And here's the mini verdict. Yes, it was deliberately removed because the same administrative paper is catalogued in an internal inventory in 1888, appears again in a revised inventory in 1904, and then vanishes with no transfer log, no destruction order, and no disposal note, leaving a clean hole where procedure should have left fingerprints. That gap is the story, because it lines up with a period when the Astor dynasty was under intense internal strain, and when New York society learned that stability could be manufactured as carefully as a ballroom facade. Picture the mansion the way it functioned in the Gilded Age, not as a romantic monument, but as a machine of control. There were rooms meant for guests, and rooms meant for records. Ledgers that counted silver, staff, and land with the same cold precision. Doors that opened for the right names and stayed shut for everyone else. In 1888, that document sits in the archive like any other line item, too practical to be decorative, too sensitive to circulate. 16 years later, in 1904, it surfaces again in a revised inventory with no marginal note, no correction, no warning, just the quiet confidence of something that was never supposed to be questioned. And then it's gone, not misplaced, not lost in a fire. Gone in the only way a powerful family makes things disappear, by removing the paper trail itself. In the Gilded Age, newspapers could turn whispers into verdicts, and verdicts into leverage. Rumor traveled faster than proof, and proof was often locked behind private keys. Witnesses, servants, clerks, junior attorneys learned what silence bought them. Letters misfiled, correspondence discarded, private agreements moved to personal safes. When a family name became a public asset, truth became a liability. If you've ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion, tell me in the comments. Sealed rooms, forgotten heirs, records that don't add up. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. And if you want more investigations like this, leave a like so the algorithm stops burying the past with them. Because once you notice a missing document, you start noticing everything else. The neat handwriting where a line should be, the dates that repeat too cleanly, the revisions that pretend nothing happened. And in the Astor Mansion, the most frightening thing isn't what the paper said. It's the fact that someone powerful enough tried to make sure you would never even know it existed. Which brings us to the first sign that something was wrong. A cold comparison between inventories and a paper that never should have survived at all. In the Gilded Age, paper didn't just record power, it moved power. A signature could redirect a fortune the way a railroad switch redirects a train. A single clause could turn an heir into a guest and a guest into an heir. And in families like the Astors, where the dynasty rested on property, marriages, and a public image polished until it could blind you, certain documents weren't administrative. They were volatile. They were leverage wrapped in ink. That is why the inventories matter, not because they were dramatic, but because they were methodical. A mansion inventory was supposed to be dull. Lists of furnishings, plate, paintings, ledgers, keys, locks, deeds stored in cabinets that smelled of cedar and dust. But for a family that treated reputation like an asset class, inventories became something else. A map of what the family allowed the world to recognize. If it was listed, it existed, officially. If it disappeared, it didn't have to be argued against. It didn't have to be defended. It could be denied. You have to imagine how controlled the environment was inside an estate like this. Not just the grand rooms, those were meant to impress, but the corridors behind them, the quiet arteries of the house, the service passages where footsteps softened on runners, where voices dropped without being asked, the places where the air changed, where doors didn't have plaques, where a cabinet could hold more than silver, it could hold an entire private version of history. In 1888, the document appears in the internal records as something important enough to catalog. That's the first signal. Not a scandal, not a headline, just a line in a system designed to keep lines. And a line like that is rarely written casually. Someone had to decide the item existed, decide what it was called, decide where it belonged. Someone had to handle it, file it, and accept that the record of it would remain. 16 years pass. The city changes. The Gilded Age hardens into routine. New. York's elite learns to survive public scrutiny by feeding it carefully measured stories. The press becomes both threat and instrument. Papers hungry for whispers, society columns eager to flatter, editorial rooms willing to soften a rumor if the right favor arrives at the right time. A family like the Astors doesn't have to silence every voice. They only have to make the loudest voices say something else. Then 1904 arrives, and the same document resurfaces in a revised inventory. No corrections. No cautionary marks. No note in the margin as if the clerk's pen hesitated and then refused to confess why. That detail is what makes the hair on the back of the story stand up. Because revisions were exactly where discomfort usually leaked out. A small annotation, a reference to relocation, a ledger entry indicating a transfer to an attorney's office, a note about consolidation, disposal, donation, destruction, anything. Instead, it sits there in 1904 as though it's normal, as though the family wants the internal record to pretend this is just another object in the house. Nothing to see, nothing to ask. But the absence of explanation doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like discipline. By 1904, a document could threaten multiple layers at once. It could endanger inheritance arrangements, especially if it contradicted a will, a trust, a marriage settlement, or a private agreement made when someone thought the walls would never speak. It could threaten alliances, a promise written so. During a negotiation, a debt acknowledged in ink, a clause that turns a handshake into a trap. It could threaten image, proof that a public narrative had been staged, that a respectable separation was a cover, that an illness was hidden, that a child existed where the family insisted there was none. The channel's favorite phrase, hidden heirs, isn't a romantic device in this era. It's a legal earthquake. And the Astors understood earthquakes. They built on land, but they also built on perception. The public saw splendor, balls under chandeliers, carriages at the curb, velvet and gloves, a name that sounded like permanence. Behind that, there was accounting. There were attorneys and trustees, private bankers, letters that traveled quietly, and decisions made in rooms where even the servants were too careful to breathe. In that world, a single piece of paper could alter a family map more than 1,000 gossip items, because gossip could be denied. Paper could be used. That's why the question becomes unavoidable. If the document was still relevant enough to list in 1904, what changed after that? Did it stop being useful? Or did it become too dangerous to acknowledge in any form? Because a family doesn't lose a record like this by accident. Not with this level of organization. Not when their legacy depends on controlling what can be proven. In a mansion where inventories were updated like a ritual, disappearance is not negligence, it's an action. And actions in this era were rarely solitary. There would have been a small chain of compliance, someone who requested, someone who approved, someone who executed, and someone who ensured it looked clean afterward. If you listen for that chain, you start hearing it in the way the house itself would have behaved. A clerk pausing a fraction too long at a cabinet before closing it. A key ring that suddenly carries one less brass tooth. A file drawer that no longer sticks because it has been opened too many times in 1 week. A servant asked to deliver a sealed envelope without being told where it came from, only where it must end. Silent witnesses are not always people who speak. Sometimes they are routines that change and pretend they never changed. There were also practical methods for making documents vanish without leaving the obvious scorch of destruction. Families of this scale didn't need to burn everything. They could reclassify. They could rename. They could relocate into private legal custody, transferred to counsel, except the note is never written. They could split the record, remove the original, keep a copy in a personal safe, and let the public-facing archive remain complete. They could make a document exist in a way that only 2 or 3 people ever knew, locked inside a banker's box, folded inside correspondence marked as something harmless, tucked into a portfolio with a different label. That's how erased records are made, not by drama, but by procedure, quietly. Rerouted until the paper becomes unfindable. And then there's the press. If a rumor began to circulate, if a society editor sniffed a story with teeth, there were ways to redirect it. Another scandal could be fed into the appetite. A philanthropic announcement could be timed to drown out whispers. A carefully placed piece praising family devotion could become a shield. Public distraction was a tool, and the Astors had access to every handle on it. The power wasn't just wealth, it was the ability to decide which story reached the street and which story stayed trapped behind mahogany doors. This is the texture of the Gilded Age, glittering surfaces with disciplined shadows underneath. It's why Golden Age secrets don't feel like mythology when you trace them through records. It's why forbidden rooms are not always a physical location. They can be a category in an archive, a redacted name, a missing folder tab. And once you start reading inventories as maps of control, you stop seeing them as lists. You start seeing them as signals. In this case, the signal is the double appearance. If the 1904 listing is real, and its plainness suggests it is, then at least one person in that moment believed the document still had value. Maybe it was being used as leverage internally. Maybe it was held as protection. Maybe it was a contingency for a dispute that hadn't erupted yet. The lack of any marginal note suggests the keeper of the record was either instructed not to explain, or too wise to leave a trace. And when the record goes silent afterward, it suggests a second instruction came later, more final, more absolute. The most chilling possibility isn't that the document revealed one secret, it's that it threatened to collapse a structure, a trust, a marriage settlement, a succession plan, a public narrative built to keep the dynasty stable. Because stability was never just comfort, it was strategy. A family name functioned like a brand long before the word existed in marketing. To protect it, you didn't only hide wrongdoing, you hid complications. You hid the messy truths that could turn the dynasty human. Now, if this story reminds you of another sealed room, another family archive, another perfect lineage with suspicious gaps, tell me below, because patterns repeat across mansions and decades. And if you want these stories before they get flattened into polite museum captions, subscribe. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, and every time you like and comment, you push back against the silence they relied on, because the silence is the point. The silence is what the Astors paid for. It's what attorneys drafted around, what clerks obeyed, what servants noticed and never said out loud. And when you return to the inventories, 1888, then 1904, you realize the document's disappearance isn't a missing object. It's a missing permission, a decision to remove not just the paper but the right to ask about it. That's when the mansion stops feeling like architecture and starts feeling like a system. Rooms built for display, corridors built for concealment, archives built for control. And somewhere inside that system, there's always one weak moment. The moment a hand hesitates, the moment a record fails to close perfectly, the moment a name is written where it shouldn't be. Because in the copy of the revised 1904 inventory, one line sits a shade darker than the others, as if the ink pressed too hard, and beneath it, barely visible, but unmistakable once you see it, there's a second mark, a faint strike through a name that someone tried to erase without rewriting the page. Once you've seen a name lightly struck through in a revised inventory, you stop reading these pages like lists and start reading them like behavior. The paper becomes a room you can enter, and every ordinary line suddenly has a temperature. So we go backward, past the clean 1904 entry, past the silence that follows, and we land in 1888, where the first anchor of proof sits exactly where it shouldn't feel dramatic at all, an inventory line written with bureaucratic calm. The 1888 record doesn't give you a story, It gives you structure, a reference number, an administrative category, a designated place of storage tied to the Astor Mansion. That's the thing about Gilded Age power. It rarely announces itself with fireworks. It prefers ledgers. And ledgers, when they're kept by families who treat legacy like an industry, don't include items by accident. Someone had to decide the document was active. Someone had to decide it belonged to the mansion's internal system instead of a lawyer's external office. Someone had to assign it a category that implied function, management, agreement, settlement, property governance, rather than sentiment. You can almost hear the environment that produced that line. The hush of a morning room after breakfast service clears, the faint drag of a chair leg on polished wood, the soft clink of a pen rest, the quiet crackle of paper as it's squared to the edge of a desk. Outside, Manhattan is expanding with a kind of confidence that looks like destiny. New money climbing, old money tightening its grip, the city's appetite for spectacle growing by the season. Inside the Astor world, spectacle is curated. Appearances are maintained with the precision of a stage manager. But backstage, where inheritance is decided, where alliances are negotiated, where reputations are protected, there is only paper and the people who know how to use it. 1888 is not a random year for a dynasty obsessed with succession. It's a period where roles inside great families often had to be renegotiated in private. Who controls which assets? Who is recognized in the right way? Who has influence without title? Who is quietly removed from a future that had once been implied? And even when no public litigation erupts, the signs of internal reordering can still show up in the places that weren't meant to be read by strangers. Revised trusts, redistributed property interests, altered allowances, sealed memoranda, new guardianship arrangements, silent agreements drafted to prevent louder ones. That's why the 1888 line matters more than any later rumor. It is a functional record, which means the document had a job to do. It likely belonged to a chain of governance, something that formalized an adjustment the family could not afford to leave informal. Because in this world, informality is risk. A handshake can be forgotten. A spoken promise can be denied, but a document, properly witnessed, properly filed, becomes a blade that doesn't dull with time. It can be used decades later in the right courtroom or the wrong newspaper office to redraw what the public believed about bloodlines and entitlement. And the Astors understood that danger intimately. Their wealth was immense, but their image was fragile in a very specific way. It depended on continuity of lineage, continuity of respectability, continuity of control. The public did not need to know every detail of their private mechanics. In fact, it was better that they didn't. The Gilded Age rewarded distance. It rewarded the kind of silence that made a family seem inevitable, almost natural, like the city skyline itself. Any paper that threatened that illusion wasn't just inconvenient, it was radioactive. So when you see the inventory entry in 1888, reference number, administrative category, location of custody, you're looking at a moment when someone in the mansion's orbit chose official existence. They didn't tuck it away with personal correspondence. They didn't label it as harmless. They didn't let it drift into a lawyer's private cabinet where the mansion's own staff could plausibly deny knowledge. They put it into the mansion's internal system, which suggests it was expected to be accessed again, consulted, used, verified. The kind of document you don't want to lose because losing it could trigger questions you can't answer without it. And questions were already dangerous. In a city where society editors could turn a fractured dinner table into a public morality play, where rivals competed not only in wealth but in narrative, one badly timed whisper could become a headline that forced a response. That's why elite families learned to manage the press the way they managed property, through friendly columnists, strategic invitations, philanthropic announcements timed like smoke screens, and quiet conversations that never appeared in print. When the wrong story threatened to surface, they didn't always suppress it head-on. They replaced it with something shinier, something safer, another ball, another donation, another marriage announcement, until the public's gaze moved on. But paper doesn't move on. Paper waits. If the 1888 document was tied to succession dynamics, redistribution of assets, formal redefinition of roles among heirs, then its survival into an internal inventory suggests it had teeth, the kind of teeth that could bite later, a clause that conditions an inheritance, a memo that clarifies a relationship the family would rather leave ambiguous, a recorded arrangement that protects someone quietly placed outside the official story. Hidden heirs doesn't have to mean a child concealed in melodrama. Sometimes it means an individual whose rights were narrowed, postponed, or redirected under a seal, so the dynasty could keep its shape. And then you start to see how forbidden rooms don't always require bricks. They can be categories. They can be storage locations. The inventory says where the document was kept, and that alone is its own kind of architecture. A designated place of custody suggests controlled access. It suggests keys. It suggests a cabinet that wasn't just furniture but policy. And in mansions like this, policy could be felt in small movements. A clerk closing a drawer with the palm flat on the wood, a glance toward the hallway before a folder is lifted, a pause before an envelope is resealed with fresh wax. Silent witnesses are everywhere in those gestures, even when no one speaks. What makes the 1888 anchor even sharper is its context of quiet reorganization. The family is adjusting itself, not publicly collapsing, but internally recalibrating. That's when documents get created, when something needs to be formalized because the informal version is no longer safe. Perhaps there was a disagreement about who had authority over certain holdings. Perhaps there was a private arrangement tied to a marriage settlement. Perhaps there was an attempt to secure unity by narrowing options, a written boundary placed around someone's future before that someone could protest. These aren't sensational guesses. They're the practical reasons dynasties wrote things down in the first place. And when you think in those terms, the later disappearance becomes less mysterious and more strategic, because a document with that kind of function can't simply vanish without consequence, unless the consequence is exactly what the family wanted: plausible denial. If the paper could one day be used against them, the safest version of the future is one where the record of the paper's existence disappears first. That's how erased records are made in the Gilded Age. You don't erase the story, you erase the infrastructure that proves the story existed. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people rarely destroy evidence in a way that looks violent? They prefer cleanliness. They prefer misfiled, relocated, no longer in the collection. They prefer the kind of disappearance that makes an honest researcher doubt their own eyes. Golden Age secrets thrive not because no one ever saw them, but because the surviving pieces are arranged to make the truth feel like paranoia. And yet, the 1888 entry doesn't feel like paranoia. It feels like routine, which is why it's so damning. Because if the document was active in 1888, it likely touched the machinery of the family, assets, succession, roles, at a moment when internal tensions were being managed rather than confessed. That means the paper wasn't trivial, it wasn't sentimental, it wasn't an ornament in the archive. It was a tool, and tools in the wrong hands become weapons. So here's what we do next. We follow the inventory's logic. We treat the reference number like a thread. We treat the category like a clue about function. We treat the stated place of custody as a map of access. Who could open the cabinet? Who could request the file? Who could deny it existed? Because once you identify where power stored its papers, you begin to understand how power stored its secrets. And in one surviving copy of that 1888 inventory, faintly creased, the ink slightly feathered in places as if it lived too close to damp wood, there's a tiny irregularity beside the reference line, a narrow smear as though a finger brushed the page before it dried, and just beneath the text, a faint indentation where another entry once pressed through, like a name that used to sit there and was carefully lifted out, leaving only the pressure behind. By the time you reach 1904, the paper trail has developed a strange kind of gravity. It isn't the loudness of a scandal. It's the persistence of a problem that refuses to die in the dark. 16 years after the first anchor in 1888, The document returns to the inventory like a ghost that never learned it was supposed to stay. Buried, listed again with an almost mechanical calm, as if the clerk's hand knew better than to pause. No status update, no marginal explanation, no line that says resolved, superseded, transferred, or destroyed. Just presence, quiet, functional, and uncomfortably alive. And that's where the absence begins to speak. Because in a well-governed Gilded Age household, especially one with a dynasty's paranoia for continuity, an inventory was not simply a record of objects. It was a record of permission. What is acknowledged is what can be managed. What is unacknowledged becomes uncontrollable. So when the document is listed again in 1904, it implies something far more consequential than the fact that a sheet of paper physically survived. It implies the issue behind it survived. It implies the clause, the agreement, the unsettled arrangement, the thing the family could not fully close, still required a living place inside their internal system. You can almost picture the scene without needing anyone to confess it. The house itself is older now, but it has that particular discipline of old money. Everything repaired before it looks worn, everything polished before it looks questioned. A morning routine moves through the mansion like clockwork. Footsteps soften on carpets. A curtain is drawn an inch more to shape the light. A door is closed gently, not because of noise, but because of habit. Somewhere behind the grand rooms, in an office that smells of paper and cedar, a ledger is opened with care. The spine gives a faint crackle. A page is turned slowly, not for drama, just because those pages are thick and someone was trained to treat them like law. In 1904, American society is in a different mood. It has matured into the machine the Gilded Age built. The country is flush with industrial confidence, and the elite have learned that the public can be entertained, managed, and redirected. Newspapers have grown more influential, and so have the methods for shaping what they print. Wealth doesn't just sponsor buildings anymore. It sponsors narratives. It funds charitable events that look like virtue. It funds society pages that look like harmless gossip but function like social currency. And when rumors start to gather around the wrong topic, inheritance, legitimacy, private agreements, there are ways to shift the lens. A family like the Astors wouldn't panic publicly. They would negotiate privately. They would tighten internal language. They would instruct clerks without leaving written instruction. They would move meetings into rooms without windows. They would let an attorney speak the words that family members never would. And if a document still remained active in 1904, it likely means those negotiations had not reached the kind of closure that allowed the paper to be safely retired. That's what makes the return so crucial. Continuity of problem. If the issue had been fully resolved, if the agreement had been executed cleanly, if the dispute had died, if the risk had evaporated, the document would have changed status. It would have been archived definitively, replaced, or moved out of the mansion's working custody. But the 1904 entry treats it like a live wire that everyone pretends is just part of the wall. Necessary enough to keep in the system, uncomfortable enough not to annotate. And that combination, necessary, uncomfortable, unspoken, is the native language of Golden Age secrets. Because the truth is, families didn't only hide wrongdoing, they hid instability. They hid the fragility of their legacies. The fear wasn't always criminal exposure. Sometimes the fear was structural. A clause that could fracture a succession plan, a memorandum that could empower a sidelined relative, a record that could validate someone who was kept politely invisible. Hidden heirs aren't always hidden in attics. Sometimes they're hidden in language, recognized in a private arrangement but absent from the public story. A document tied to inheritance or family agreements becomes a threat not because it is immoral, but because it contradicts the narrative of inevitability the dynasty depends on. And then there's the matter of time. 16 years is long enough for a private compromise to sour, long enough for one generation to lose patience and another to inherit consequences, long enough for a witness to die, for a friend to become an enemy, for an attorney to retire, for a family member to remarry, for loyalties to change. When a sensitive paper remains active across that span, it implies the agreement it represents is fragile, still being renegotiated, still being protected, still being used as leverage, not a closed chapter. A quiet tug of war. That's where silent witnesses become terrifying. Not the people who might have seen the document, the people who might have typed it, sealed it, carried it down a hallway. Many of them would have vanished into history without leaving a line of testimony, but the mansion itself keeps track in other ways. Repeated access patterns, the subtle wear on a drawer handle, the way a key ring is kept closer than usual, the way conversations stop when footsteps approach. It's in the behavior. It's in the fact that the document is listed again, but the record refuses to breathe around it. And the moment you accept that the 1904 listing is a sign of ongoing risk, the next stage, the total disappearance, stops looking like accident. It starts looking like strategy. Because strategy is what a dynasty uses when it can't tolerate uncertainty. When the document remains active too long, it can't be allowed to become discoverable. Not through a casual estate audit, not through an archivist decades later who stumbles onto the wrong inventory box, not through a court subpoena in some unrelated dispute, not through a scandal-hungry reporter who gets access to a forgotten collection and finds a reference number that shouldn't exist. To avoid that, powerful families didn't need to destroy the document in a dramatic way. They only needed to remove the proof that it ever belonged to the official internal system. That's the genius of erased records. You erase the footprint, not the body. You pull the reference from the index. You remove the folder tab. You revise the later inventory pages so the chain doesn't connect. You let the paper live somewhere else. Private counsel, a banker's box, a sealed packet behind a false back in a cabinet, while the mansion's official memory becomes clean again. And the public-facing world, so eager to be dazzled, rarely notices what becomes clean too quickly. It would have been easy to bury the story under spectacle. A well-timed gala, a philanthropic pledge, a marriage announcement framed as romance instead of consolidation, a society columnist suddenly obsessed with a safer scandal, someone else's divorce, someone else's indiscretion, while the Astor machine quietly sealed its own fractures. The press was not a single enemy to be fought. It was a river to be redirected, and money knew exactly where to place the stones. So the reappearance in 1904 isn't simply a detail in a ledger. It's a moment where the dynasty admits, in the only language it trusts, that the danger still exists. It's an institutional confession written without emotion. We are still managing this. We still need this paper. We still cannot close the file. And if that's true, then whatever happened after 1904, whatever finally triggered the decision to make the document vanish completely, was not routine housekeeping. It was an intervention, a final move. Because something shifted from uncomfortable but necessary to unacceptable to acknowledge. Perhaps the negotiations hardened into a threat. Perhaps someone gained the leverage the family feared. Perhaps a private promise began to look like a public liability. Perhaps a name that had been kept off the stage demanded the right to appear. Perhaps an internal compromise started to crumble, and the only way to protect continuity was to remove the very existence of the problem from the record. That's how a dark legacy protects itself. Not with noise, but with silence made deliberate. And when you hold the 1904 inventory page up to the light, there's a subtle difference in the paper tone near the entry, as if the sheet was handled more than the ones around it, fingertips returning to that line again and again. The ink is steady, but the page carries a faint crease that doesn't match the fold of the book, like it was lifted out once, pressed flat on another surface, and put back with care. And just above the reference number, in the narrow space where a clerk might have written a note but didn't, there's a tiny scratch in the margin, one sharp mark, as if a pen touched down, hesitated, and then refused to write what it knew. After 1904, the trail doesn't thin out. It doesn't fade. It doesn't drift into ambiguity the way old paperwork often does. It stops, as if the archive itself decided it had heard enough. The document never appears again in any known inventory. It doesn't resurface in disposal lists, doesn't show up as transferred, doesn't leave behind a clerical bruise, no reference number echoed in a later revision, no tidy note that would allow a future reader to nod and move on. In a world obsessed with control, that kind of clean absence isn't forgetfulness, it's selection. Because elite archives in the Gilded Age weren't designed to preserve truth. They were designed to preserve interests. They were the opposite of careless. The Astor machine, like every great dynasty that survived the era's scrutiny, understood a principle that still holds today. You can survive rumors, you can survive gossip, you can even survive certain scandals, but you cannot survive documentation that makes denial impossible. Paper is what turns a whisper into a legal problem. Paper is what turns a family dispute into a public dispute. And when a document crosses the line from manageable to uncontainable, the only safe strategy is not to argue with it. It's to remove the ground it stands on. So imagine the practical moment where that decision becomes inevitable. Not as a dramatic midnight burning, but as a morning adjustment that looks like routine. A door opens in a corridor that guests never see. A brass key slides into a lock without a sound. A drawer is pulled with 2 fingers, carefully, as if even the wood is listening. The folder comes out, thin enough to look harmless, heavy enough to change a future. The light in the room is wrong for reading. Someone turns the lamp, and the shade throws a warmer circle onto the desk. A seal is checked. Wax cracked once, long ago. The paper inside isn't waved around. It's laid flat, treated like something that could stain. This is how the archive chooses to forget. It isn't mystical, it's procedural. The same kind of procedure that created the inventory line in 1888. The same discipline that allowed the document to be listed again in 1904 without comment. But now the discipline has shifted purpose. Now it's no longer about managing a sensitive issue. It's about removing the possibility of formal questioning later, because the family has decided that the safest future is one in which the question cannot be asked with evidence. That's the uncomfortable hypothesis, and it's the most plausible one. The document became an absolute risk, not necessarily because it proved a single sensational scandal, but because it threatened structure. It threatened continuity. It threatened the ability to say, with a straight face and a steady voice, that the dynasty's public story was the only story. A paper connected to inheritance, succession, or internal agreements can become catastrophic in a very quiet way. It can validate someone who was kept politely invisible. It can empower a claim that was meant to expire in private. It can show that an arrangement existed which contradicts the official narrative, one that society columns never printed, one that charities never erased, one that the mansion's grandeur was built to distract from. And the Astors didn't just protect wealth, they protected the architecture of legitimacy. In the Gilded Age, legitimacy wasn't only blood, it was recognition. It was how the family allowed names to appear, on invitations, in newspapers, in legal instruments, in the social geography of New York. When a person is recognized, they can't be unrecognized. Without friction. When a person is erased, it has to be done early, cleanly, with paper. That is why hidden heirs haunt this era, not as folklore, but as administrative outcomes. People whose existence could be acknowledged privately, while their role was edited publicly. People who were present in the machinery, but absent from the display. And if a single document contained the wrong kind of recognition, if it recorded an agreement, a condition, a promise, an acknowledgement, then keeping it active for too long would be like keeping a lit match in a drawer full of cloth. At first it's manageable, it can be watched, it can be handled carefully, but time changes everything. Attorneys die, loyal clerks leave, families split into factions. A private compromise becomes an old wound. And in those moments, paper becomes dangerous, not because it is new, but because it is old. Because it can be pulled out at the wrong time and claim the authority of history. So the family does what powerful Families have always done when they sense a threat they can't argue away. They tighten the circle, and they rewrite the conditions under which truth is permitted to exist. There are many ways to do that without ever producing a dramatic destruction order. You don't write the command. You imply it. You move the document from a place of institutional memory into a place of personal custody. You remove its reference from indexes. You separate the inventory line from any future revision. You let the official archive remain complete, while the sensitive paper disappears into the private legal bloodstream of the dynasty, where it can be controlled, interpreted, or denied by those who hold the keys. And sometimes the most effective form of destruction is simply to make a document unfindable, not burned, relocated, not denied, reclassified, not destroyed, sealed. The public archive, the kind an outsider might access decades later, would never show the true chain. It would show what the family allowed to be shown. And in the early 20th century, that boundary was easier to enforce than modern audiences like to believe. Records were fragmented across private offices, trust companies, attorneys' vaults, personal safes. Public registries held some truths. Private registries held the ones that mattered, and between them was a corridor of influence, a polite request, a phone call, a favor repaid quietly, a file temporarily unavailable. In the era of paper, control didn't require total erasure. It required control of access, which is why the absence after 1904 feels so final. Because the silence becomes the new agreement. Once the document is gone from the known inventories, the family gains something more valuable than secrecy: insulation. A future challenger can be told truthfully that there is no record. A journalist can be redirected toward more entertaining stories. A distant relative can be dismissed as bitter or delusional. And the dynasty can keep presenting itself as stable, continuous, inevitable, because the one thing that could have forced a formal reckoning has been removed from the realm of formal proof. And look at how that changes the atmosphere of the mansion itself. A house like this doesn't just hold furniture, it holds boundaries. It teaches people where they can walk, how loudly they can speak, what they can ask without being answered. After 1904, that boundary hardens. The back corridors feel narrower. The office door feels heavier when it closes. A servant pauses before stepping into a room, waiting for the sound of a drawer shutting. An attorney's visits become more discreet, more scheduled, less conversational. The mansion continues to host the performance of wealth, but backstage, the script is being revised. That's the nature of a dark legacy. It doesn't announce itself. It reorganizes. It becomes quieter. It becomes more efficient. And if you're wondering whether this kind of choice, an archive choosing to forget, was common, the answer is, it wasn't common in the way normal misfiling is common. It required intent. It required someone with authority over the household records, someone with the confidence to remove not just a paper, but the institutional acknowledgement of the paper. That kind of move doesn't happen without a reason, because it carries risk of its own. Removing a record can create suspicion among insiders. It can start whispers that are harder to control. It can create factions, those who know and those who suspect. Which means whatever the document represented had become riskier than the suspicion. And that brings us to the most unsettling implication. The document didn't disappear because the problem ended. The document disappeared because the problem could no longer be managed in daylight, not even the dim daylight of internal bureaucracy. It had to be moved into the kind of darkness that doesn't leave reference numbers behind. Because somewhere, in a surviving packet of estate papers, a bundle tied with an old ribbon that has lost its color, there's an inventory page after 1904 with a gap that doesn't look like damage. It looks like removal. A rectangular absence in the paper where a slip might have been once attached, and when you tilt it toward the light, you can see the faint outline of adhesive residue, like a label was peeled away slowly, carefully, by someone who wanted the cabinet to look untouched, while ensuring no one would ever find the door it used to name. When the archive chooses to forget, it doesn't erase the past. It freezes it in place, like a portrait kept in a dark hallway where no one lingers long enough to notice what's missing. And once the Astor document vanishes after 1904, we're left with the most revealing thing an elite family ever leaves behind: context. Not the confession, but the perimeter. The years between 1888 and 1904 weren't quiet years for American fortune. They were years when dynasties learned that money alone wasn't enough. Control had to be formalized, reputations had to be engineered, and succession had to be protected from both rivals and relatives. That's why the question isn't, what did the paper say? The question is, what kind of paper forces a family to remove its own footprint? In the Gilded Age, documents like this rarely involved poetry. They involved mechanisms, private clauses that redirected assets without headlines, internal concessions that kept factions from splitting, compromises that couldn't survive daylight, because daylight invites lawyers, and lawyers invite courts, and courts invite newspapers. A dynasty doesn't fear a courtroom because it fears guilt. It fears a courtroom because it loses control of the story. Once the wrong agreement becomes a matter of record, the public narrative stops being a performance and becomes a cross-examination. And the Astors were a family whose public narrative was part of their balance sheet. You can see the era's pressure in the way. These fortunes were structured. Estates weren't simply owned, they were managed through trusts, trustees, and carefully arranged authority, often designed to prevent the very thing that destroys old money fastest: internal disagreement turning into public litigation. The moment heirs begin to question the architecture, every invisible clause becomes dangerous. A document that acknowledges an off-the-books commitment or a condition attached to inheritance can become a lever in the hands of someone who was never meant to hold it. A hidden heir doesn't need a dramatic reveal. A hidden heir only needs standing, and standing can be built from paper. If the Astor document had survived into the wrong decade, it could have done more than embarrass someone. It could have reopened arrangements that were meant to be permanent. It could have pulled old promises into new disputes. It could have exposed that unity was purchased, that continuity was negotiated, that stability was maintained with agreements that couldn't be admitted publicly without weakening the dynasty's sheen. And once a family like that senses the risk, they don't solve it by answering questions. They solve it by removing the possibility of formal questioning in the first place. That's the economic consequence hiding beneath the elegance. If a paper like this surfaces, heirs can challenge old distributions. Institutions can reevaluate decisions based on agreements that were assumed to be clean. Trustees can be forced to explain why certain interests were favored. And even if the family wins, the process itself becomes exposure. The Gilded Age elite understood that some victories are too loud to afford. So what could realistically be at stake? Think in categories rather than plot twists. A private settlement that kept a dispute from reaching court. A concession that traded money for silence. A condition that limited an heir's control in exchange for keeping the family name intact. A memorandum that clarified authority over assets. Who could sign, who could sell, who could block, or something more socially toxic. Proof that a relationship existed which society would weaponize. That a dependency was hidden. That a scandal was managed by contract rather than morality. Paper like that doesn't only document decisions, it documents the price of keeping the dynasty smooth on the surface. And notice how the timeline behaves. The document is present in 1888, active enough to be formally logged. It is present again in 1904, still necessary, still unresolved, still too uncomfortable to annotate. Then it disappears entirely. That arc suggests not that the problem ended, but that the family decided the problem could no longer be managed within the official archive. The removal doesn't heal the past, it seals it. It turns a living dispute into a locked room, and locked rooms always create their own kind of silence. The servants don't discuss them, the clerks learn to file around them. The heirs grow up sensing where the air changes in certain hallways. The press learns which rumors turn into dead ends. Silent witnesses accumulate, a trustee who can't recall, a secretary whose letters were burned, a family friend who changes the subject too quickly at dinner. The house keeps going, but it goes on with a line missing, and everyone becomes fluent in pretending they never saw it. That's what dark legacy really means in this channel's universe. Not a single war. Scandal, but a system that survives by editing itself. And sometimes the system slips, just enough to show you the shape of what was cut out. In a later set of estate documents, papers that look innocent until you compare them closely, there's a short list of custodial keys for the mansion's internal files. The handwriting is neat, the formatting consistent, the kind of page meant to be boring. But one key designation is scratched through so thoroughly the paper fibers lift, as if the pen was pressed hard in impatience. And beside it, in a different ink tone, there's a tiny replacement note that doesn't match the numbering scheme, like a new door was added without ever being placed on the plan. And at the very bottom, almost hidden by a shadow of old folding, there's a single initial, one that appears nowhere else in the set, written as if someone paused, listened for footsteps, and signed the silence. The most effective secrets in the Gilded Age weren't protected by locks. They were protected by time. A door can be forced, a safe can be cracked, a rumor can slip past the right ears. But silence, once it becomes policy, ages into something almost unchallengeable. And that is the real consequence of removing a document. It doesn't only erase an object from a cabinet, it reshapes the future's ability to ask. Because without the paper, the next generation inherits uncertainty instead of evidence. A dispute that might have been settled cleanly becomes a family legend told in careful tones. A contradiction that could have been proven becomes unverified, and an official narrative, polished, repeated, reinforced, gets to solidify simply because no one can produce the one page that would interrupt it. The archive doesn't need to lie. It only needs to be incomplete in exactly the right place. You can feel how intentional that is when you imagine the afterlife of these records. Decades later, a researcher sits under a reading lamp, fingertips blackened slightly from old ink and dust, turning pages that were never meant to outlive the people who wrote them. A ledger opens with a soft sigh. The paper is thick, almost fabric-like, and it carries the faint smell of storage, dry wood, old glue, a trace of smoke that could be nothing or could be everything. The researcher finds the 1888 entry, finds the 1904 entry, then follows the trail forward and hits a blank where procedure should have continued. Not a dramatic blank, just the absence of a name, an absence of a reference number. The kind of quiet gap that makes you check the page order twice, and that's the shield. Not because it convinces you nothing happened, but because it prevents you from stating, with legal certainty, what did. Silence narrows the field of proof until only the dynasty's preferred version feels responsible to repeat. Historians become cautious. Institutions become conservative. Stories get told with qualifying words, perhaps likely unclear, while the official account gets told with confidence. The result is cultural. The family's memory becomes smoother than its reality. There are secrets that survive only because nobody asks the right question, and in these houses the right question was trained out of people early. Servants learned not to linger. Junior clerks learned not to annotate. Friends learned not to press. Even heirs learned which topics caused the room to cool by half a degree. The mansion itself taught silence, the way doors closed softly, the way conversations paused when someone approached, the way certain rooms stayed lit even when no one entered them. Silent witnesses were everywhere, and their testimony was never spoken, only lived. That's why the Astor disappearance feels less like a missing piece and more like a mechanism. Remove the document, and you remove the future's ability to challenge the past formally. Without a paper trail, a later heir can't easily reopen arrangements. A rival can't build a case. A journalist can't move from rumor to proof. The dynasty doesn't have to win arguments, it only has to deny them oxygen. The silence becomes the long-term strategy, and time does the rest. And time is loyal to wealth in a way people rarely admit. It wears down outrage. It turns sharp questions into old stories. It replaces living witnesses with portraits. It makes inconvenient memories sound like melodrama. Meanwhile, the family name remains, carved into buildings, printed on programs, repeated in society columns as, if it were always clean. The absence becomes an invisible asset, one that compounds over decades. So when we talk about legacy, we aren't talking about what the Astors did. We're talking about what they managed to keep from being documented in a way that could be used against them later. That's the Golden Age secret hiding in plain sight. Control doesn't end at money. It extends into what can be proven. It extends into what is allowed to survive. And sometimes that strategy leaves behind small, accidental relics, things too minor to destroy, too strange to explain. A misfiled backing sheet from an old frame, a key list with one designation scratched so hard the paper fibers lift like scars, a caption line where the ink out is heavier than any other mark in the bundle, as if someone was less careful for a moment, more urgent than polite. These are the places where silence shows its teeth, because in the same packet where that inked-out caption appears, there's a thin, brittle envelope with no letter inside, just a single corner of torn stationery, the kind used for formal correspondence. The embossing is still visible, but the name has been carefully rubbed away. And along the torn edge, you can make out one partial word, stopped mid-stroke, like the hand that wrote it heard something in the hallway and lifted the pen too fast, leaving the rest of the message sealed in the air. The Astor Mansion lasted the way certain names last in America, not just through stone and money, but through the careful management of what the public is allowed to remember. Walk past a facade like that, and you feel permanence as if it were natural, carved into the architecture, reinforced by repetition, polished by generations who understood that legacy is not only inherited, it is maintained. And without the missing document, the mansion's story reads exactly the way power prefers its own biography to read: linear, inevitable, unbroken. But once you know a paper was logged in 1888, listed again in 1904, and then removed so cleanly it leaves no administrative trail, the building stops being a symbol and starts being evidence. The house still stands, yes, but it stands in the shadow of an absence that helped it stand. Because with that document, the mansion's timeline might not look smooth at all. It might look unstable, full of internal bargaining, contested authority, fragile compromises held together by clauses no one wanted in a courtroom. Without the paper, the public can treat to the dynasty as a single continuous line. With it, you'd likely see the bends, the moments when control had to be renegotiated, when a settled inheritance was only settled on paper, when a private agreement was the thin beam keeping a public ceiling from collapsing. That's the uncomfortable truth embedded in this legacy. Solidity can be manufactured, not by inventing achievements, but by removing the proof of vulnerability. In the Gilded Age, vulnerability was the one thing old money could not afford to display, because display invited interpretation, and interpretation invited rivals. A dynasty's enemies weren't only in boardrooms, they were in drawing rooms, law offices, newspapers, and families of comparable status looking for an opening. And the opening was always the same: internal fracture. If the public ever saw that the permanent name relied on private concessions, the spell could weaken. So the dynasty protected the spell the way it protected its assets, with structure, with policy, with silence. And silence, once reinforced, becomes a kind of architectural feature. It doesn't need guards to defend it. It defends itself. It turns future debates into speculation. It turns potential challenges into insufficient evidence. It turns living disputes into dust-covered myths. Researchers, decades later, can point to gaps and ask careful questions, but without the paper, they can't force the door. Disputes lose the one thing that makes them actionable: documentation. Meanwhile, the official narrative gains weight simply because it is the only version that can be cited without risk. That's how incomplete archives shape collective memory, not by shouting a lie, but by refusing to keep what could contradict the story. So when we say, the mansion resisted time, we should also hear the quieter meaning. It resisted explanation. It outlived witnesses. It outlasted scandals. It survived the way power often survives, by controlling what can be proved. A dark legacy. Doesn't have to be criminal to be dangerous. It only has to be protected by omission. And when you zoom out beyond the Astors, you realize this isn't just one mansion's puzzle. It's a template. It suggests that much of America's elite memory, who mattered, who belonged, who inherited, who vanished, may have been shaped as much by erased records as by preserved ones. The uncomfortable implication is social, not personal. We may be reading the past through files that were curated by those who had the most to lose. The Gilded Age gave us monuments, and it also gave us missing folders. It gave us philanthropic stories, and it gave us private settlements sealed behind law and etiquette. It gave us portraits whose frames remained, even when the names beneath them were rubbed away. And that is why the Astor Mansion's legend feels so smooth, because the rough parts were edited out. In a later photograph catalog, one that survives only because it was considered harmless, there's an image of a corridor inside the mansion, taken at an angle that favors symmetry. The carpet runner is straight. The sconces glow softly. Everything looks composed. But if you stare long enough, you notice something that doesn't belong. Along the right wall, the paneling pattern breaks for a few inches as if a seam was covered too carefully. A door that doesn't appear in the original floor plan. No handle visible, no label, just a line in the wood that catches the light differently, like a boundary drawn by someone who wanted the house to look eternal, while keeping one last room out of the story. When records disappear, they don't vanish alone. They take whole alternate versions of a life with them, paths that could have explained a decision, a marriage, a transfer of wealth, a sudden exile from society. And the cruel thing about the Astor case is how cleanly it demonstrates that selective destruction doesn't simply hide the past. It redraws the boundaries of what the future is allowed to prove. Certain questions don't become difficult, they become structurally unanswerable. That's the risk of incomplete archives in the Gilded Age. The silence isn't neutral, it's an instrument. You can feel it in the way the modern researcher is forced to move through the story. With the document gone, the debate must rest on indicios, patterns, gaps, behaviors that repeat across elite households. You're left reading the negative space. Why a line appears twice and then stops. Why there is no transfer. Notation, no disposal entry, no administrative echo. Why the inventory behaves as if a problem remains active and then abruptly becomes too dangerous to acknowledge. That is a method of investigation, yes, but it is also a limitation imposed by someone else's long-dead decision. And that limitation is not academic in the abstract. It changes outcomes, it changes reputations, it changes inheritance, it changes whose voice can be believed. Because in the world the Astors lived in, paper was power. Precisely because it could outlive the people who wrote it. A letter sealed in 1888 could destabilize a claim in 1918. A clause drafted in 1904 could define a family's internal hierarchy long after the original signers were portraits on a wall. That's why destroying a document was never just an emotional act. It was a long-term strategy. Remove the evidence, remove the future dispute. Without the paper, a later heir might feel wronged, but can't prove the mechanics of the wrong. Without the paper, a rival can whisper but can't litigate. Without the paper, a journalist can hint but can't land the blow that forces a response. The archive chooses the winners by choosing what survives, and it rarely looks as brutal as it is. It looks like housekeeping, like estate management, like the tidying that follows death, when trunks are sorted, drawers are emptied, and a family decides what becomes history and what becomes ash. You can almost hear it, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of a folder set down, the faint crackle of a brittle envelope. A clerk clearing his throat once, not as hesitation but as a signal. Someone is present, Someone is watching. The rhythm of paper being aligned, the scent of old glue warmed by a lamp. No one says the forbidden words. No one writes the instruction. The silence does the work. That is why the Astor disappearance matters, even if we never recover the paper. The revelation isn't what was written. The revelation is that an institution, an elite, household functioning like a private government, treated the document as a controllable risk until it became an intolerable one. And when it became intolerable, the system didn't argue with it. It eliminated the record of it. That behavior is the closest thing we get to confession in a world that trained itself never to confess. It also forces a broader discomfort. How many other dynasties are remembered through curated survivals? How many clean biographies are clean because the mess was removed before it could be cataloged? How many social legends of unity, virtue, inevitability rest on files that are incomplete by design? The Gilded Age loved permanence, but permanence often required editing. The Golden Age secrets weren't only in forbidden rooms. They were in the careful trimming of what history was allowed to verify. And for historians, for anyone trying to reconstruct truth, that creates a dilemma that doesn't resolve neatly. Without the document, you can't claim precision. You can't point to a paragraph and say, "Here, this is what happened." You can only build a case from the constellation, the repeated listings, the sudden absence, the lack of administrative residue, the pattern across other old money archives where disputes were settled off the public record, where letters were burned, where trustees became silent witnesses, where erased records created smoother legacies. But acknowledging that isn't defeat. It's a different kind of recovery. Recognizing the erasure doesn't bring the paper back, but it returns complexity to the past. It refuses the dynasty's preferred simplicity. It says, the record is incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself part of the story, because no proof is not the same as no event. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes no proof is the clearest sign that proof once existed and was removed with intention. So when we look again at that corridor photograph, the one where the paneling seam breaks too neatly, we stop, treating it like an architectural curiosity, and start treating it like a metaphor made physical. A door that doesn't appear on the plan is exactly what an incomplete archive produces. A boundary you can see but cannot cross with certainty. A hidden room in the story where the missing document should be. And then there's the final, smaller detail, the one that keeps the air heavy. In a later bound volume, an estate register that otherwise reads like routine, there's a page where the numbering jumps by one, as if an entry once existed between two lines and was lifted out. The paper is slightly thinner there, as if it was pressed and smoothed after removal, and in the gutter near the spine, just where a binder's thread would catch, you can see a faint, wavering impression of ink that never made it to the surface, a ghost line from a removed sheet, ending in a single initial that looks like it was written too hard, and then forced into silence. Today, the document doesn't come back. There is no known copy tucked into a banker's box, no convenient carbon sheet, no tidy cross-reference that lets you reconstruct its clauses like a puzzle you can finish with enough patience. The trail ends where it was designed to end, with administrative evidence of existence, followed by engineered absence. And standing in the present with that kind of silence is strangely disorienting, because modern instincts want closure, want a reveal, a signature, a paragraph that solves everything. But the Astor case doesn't offer that satisfaction. It offers something colder, the understanding that the removal itself was the point, and that the mechanism still works precisely because it denies us the comfort of proof. If you've ever spent time around old archives, real paper, real bindings, you know how physical history is. Pages resist your fingers. Dust clings to the creases. Ink shines differently depending on how the light hits it. You can hear a book's spine complain as it opens. Like the past, doesn't enjoy being disturbed. And then you find a gap that doesn't behave like age. It behaves like choice. A missing line that would have required a clerk to do something, and yet there's no trace that the clerk ever did it. A reference number that should echo later but never does. A status update that never appears. A disposal list that stays clean. That kind of absence has a temperature. It makes the room feel smaller, as if the archive is teaching you, even now where you're not allowed to. Go, because what remains when the paper doesn't return is not nothing. What remains is the pattern. 1888, a functional entry with custody tied to the mansion. 1904, the same document listed again, almost automatically, as if too uncomfortable to annotate but too necessary to ignore. Then a silence so complete it looks like administrative perfection. That's not the shape of accident. That's the shape of a decision made by people who understood time better than we like to admit. People who knew that the safest scandal is the one that can never be proven in a formal way, not because it never happened, but because the evidence cannot be summoned. In the Gilded Age, wealth didn't only buy objects. It bought structure. It bought a private legal universe where trusts, settlements, and custodial systems could operate outside public curiosity. It bought relationships with attorneys and trustees who treated discretion as a profession. It bought influence over how stories traveled, how society. Columns framed events, how a philanthropic pledge could replace a rumor, how a competing headline could be fed to the press like a safer meal. The public saw splendor. Behind it, the dynasty managed risk, and sometimes risk looked like a single sheet of paper that threatened to turn whispers into leverage. That is why, in the present, the ethical question becomes unavoidable. If we accept the silence as definitive, if we shrug and say, no document, no story, we end up repeating the exact logic that created the disappearance. We let the archive's incompleteness dictate our moral confidence. We allow the absence of proof to become proof of absence. And that isn't neutrality. That's obedience to a system designed to protect itself. Questioning the silence doesn't mean inventing a confession. It means refusing to let curated memory pass as complete memory. It means saying, out loud, that there are Golden Age secrets that survive, not because they are too mysterious to understand, but because the evidence was strategically removed to keep understanding from becoming actionable. It means recognizing that erased records are not a minor archival inconvenience. They are an instrument of power that continues shaping what can be known, what can be claimed, what can be challenged. The most unsettling part is how familiar the mechanism feels once you see it clearly. The destruction or concealment of sensitive documents wasn't a melodramatic act performed once in a panic. It was a habit of governance. It was a family protecting continuity the way a corporation protects its brand. It was a mansion operating like a private state, complete with controlled access, restricted custody, and silent witnesses trained to treat omission as loyalty. And when you look at it that way, the Astor case becomes less about one missing paper and more about a template of forgetting, one that did not die with the people who used it. Because the present inherits consequences, whether it inherits documents or not. A missing file can determine which version of a family becomes respectable history. It can determine whether a later heir has a basis to question an arrangement, or whether they are dismissed as inconvenient. It can determine whether a researcher writes unclear and moves on, or whether they linger long enough to notice the behavior of the record itself. And it can determine whether a mansion becomes a monument to permanence, or a monument to what was edited out to make permanence believable. This is where the story begins to feel less like a mystery and more like a warning. Once paper is removed, complexity is removed with it. The public gets a cleaner narrative, but it's a narrative that may be unearned. The past becomes simpler than it was. The dynasty becomes more inevitable than it truly was. And the moral discomfort is not only academic, it's cultural. Because America's memory of its elite, its foundational names, its philanthropic legends, its social myths, may rest on archives that were incomplete by design. That is not a reason to abandon the search. It's a reason to change what we consider evidence. In cases like this, you learn to treat absence as a form of presence. You compare the way inventories normally behave, how they document transfers, how they log disposal, how they annotate revisions. and you notice when a single thread breaks too cleanly. You study patterns across families and institutions, not to accuse recklessly, but to understand how power historically protected itself. You trace custody practices, which documents remained in a mansion's internal system versus which were pushed into private legal custody. You study the choreography of silence, the missing marginal note, the sudden jump in numbering, the consistent refusal to explain. The archive doesn't tell you what happened, but it tells you what someone didn't want you to be able to say. And then, slowly, the mansion itself starts to feel like it has two histories. The public one, with its polished rooms and linear timelines, and the private one, written in a language of gaps. In that private history, the hallway seam matters. The scratched-through key designation matters. The caption line inked out so hard the paper fibers lift matters. The torn stationery corner matters, especially because it suggests interruption, not completion. These are not solutions. They're pressure points. They're places where the machine of legacy left a faint bruise. It's also where the human cost hides without ever needing melodrama, because when a record is erased, someone's version of events is erased with it. It might be an heir's leverage. It might be a guardian's obligation. It might be a compromise that kept a conflict from turning violent, or a concession that kept a vulnerable person quiet. It might be evidence that someone existed in the family's private accounting, even if they never existed in its public story. In that sense, the missing document is not just a curiosity, it's a locked door in a narrative where locked doors often keep people on the wrong side. So what do we do with that here, now, when the paper will not return? We don't pretend the silence is innocent, and we don't pretend we can replace the document with fantasy. We do something more uncomfortable and more honest. We name the mechanism. We acknowledge that the disappearance was a conscious act. We treat the administrative trail as a confession of behavior. We accept that the past is not simpler because the archive is incomplete. It is more complex, more contested, more human. And we keep asking the question that the record was designed to stop. What was this paper protecting, and who was it protecting it from? Because there's a final dilemma that lingers in every Gilded Age archive once you notice it. If the most powerful families could curate what survived, then every clean legacy must be read with suspicion, not cynicism, suspicion. A careful, disciplined suspicion that understands how easily permanence can be staged, that understands how quickly a dynasty can turn history into branding when it controls the files, that understands why forbidden rooms exist not only in stone corridors, but in collections where certain folders never made it past a fire. Certain names never made it past a clerk's pen. Certain questions never made it past etiquette. And the Astor Mansion, standing quiet in the imagination like a monument, becomes something else. In that light, not only a symbol of power, but a symbol of what power can remove. In the same reading room where the inventories lie open, there's a moment when the air shifts. Someone walks by, a chair creaks, a page is turned too quickly and then smoothed down as if the hands remembered they were handling something sacred. And when you hold the later estate register at an angle, you catch it again. That small jump in numbering, that place where a line should have existed between two lines. The nom, paper near the spine looks slightly compressed, like it once held an extra sheet that is no longer there. And right beside the gap, so faint you could blame it on shadow if it didn't repeat, there's a thin, darker stroke, like the tail of a letter pressed through from a page that was removed, ending in a single initial that never resolves into a name. Just a mark that sits in the margin like a door that was built to disappear, waiting in heavy silence for someone to find the outline. In the hush that follows a missing page, the mansion does what it has always done. It returns to stillness and lets time do the rest. The register closes with a soft, deliberate weight, as though the binding itself understands the value of what is no longer inside it. The reading lamp throws a narrow cone of light across the desk, and beyond that circle, the room recedes into shadow. Shelves, spines, labels, and the quiet order of an archive that appears complete until one learns where to look for what has been removed. The last clue we touched was not a confession, but a pressure mark, a numbering that jumps, a line that should exist between two lines. The faint, stubborn impression of ink pressed through from a sheet that once lay there and no longer does. In the world of old money, those impressions matter more than any rumor. They are the residue of procedure interrupted, of a decision made quietly enough to avoid documentation, yet forceful enough to alter the shape of the surviving record. The Astor document did not vanish into ordinary forgetfulness. It exited the archive the same way certain names exit society pages, with practiced cleanliness and with an understanding that what cannot be cited cannot be fought. That is the true architecture of Gilded Age power. It is not only built from marble and mahogany, not only displayed beneath chandeliers and along carriage lines. It is built from what the public may verify. It is built from the careful distinction between what is spoken and what is provable. In a dynasty whose wealth depended on property and perception in equal measure, silence was never the absence of sound. It was an active instrument, sharpened over decades, passed down like an heirloom. If the paper had remained, it would have done what paper always threatens to do. It would have outlived the people who needed it hidden. It could have reopened arrangements the family believed were settled forever. It could have forced old compromises into new courtrooms. It could have given later heirs a foundation for questions that polite society trains itself not to ask. It could have turned a private negotiation into a public fact. And in that transformation, whisper into record, record into leverage, the dynasty would have lost something wealth cannot easily repurchase: control of its own narrative. So the decision was made. Not with spectacle, but with method. A cabinet unlocked in a corridor beyond the reach of guests. A folder lifted without ceremony. A seal checked, then replaced. A page removed from the visible chain so that the chain itself could no longer be followed. The archive remained dignified. The inventory remained orderly. The mansion continued to stand as though nothing inside it had ever been unstable. That is how reputational shields are forged. Not by disproving every danger, but by ensuring the most dangerous evidence never survives long enough to be questioned. And this is where the profit of silence becomes unmistakable. The beneficiaries are not always villains. They are often institutions, households, trustees, and systems that prefer continuity to complication. Silence protects legacies from the unpredictable future. It keeps disputes from gaining legal traction. It preserves philanthropy's halo. It prevents historians from writing in definitive ink. It allows the most polished version of events to harden into what happened, simply because no one can produce the paper that proves otherwise. If the truth remained buried for decades, it is because someone found the burial useful, and someone else inherited the advantage. Yet the most unsettling part is that the mechanism does not end with the people who first used it. It persists in the present through the very shape of what survives. Researchers open boxes and find neat sequences interrupted by inexplicable gaps. Curators inherit collections that feel curated in the strictest sense of the word. Biographers trace family lines and discover that the record becomes suddenly quiet at precisely the moments when it should become loud. The Gilded Age is remembered through what it preserved and through what it chose to eliminate. Incomplete archives do not merely limit our certainty, they actively steer our conclusions. They make certain questions appear unreasonable. They make certain theories appear unprovable. And in doing so, they allow a dynasty's preferred simplicity to masquerade as historical fact. Beyond the golden E, halls exist for one purpose: to notice those seams, to stand where the paneling breaks and refuse to accept the wall as seamless simply because it looks elegant, to follow the chain until it ends, and then to treat the ending itself as evidence of intent. The Astor Mansion case is not solved here, and it will not be made comfortable. We are left deliberately with the tension between what was listed and what was erased, between what the archive admits and what it refuses. The sealed door remains sealed, but the outline of its frame has been traced. And there are other frames. There are other inventories that behave too cleanly. Other key lists where a designation is scratched through as if the paper itself had to be punished for remembering. Other portraits whose captions were inked out with a violence that etiquette could not disguise. Other stair landings where the symmetry is perfect until one notices a panel seam that catches the light differently, hinting at a door that never appears on any plan. In these mansions, the architecture of silence repeats because the logic of long-term protection repeats. If you wish to remain present when the next sealed door finally opens, then stay close to these halls. Subscribe, so that when another archive yields a gap too precise to be accidental, you are here to see it. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury, and sometimes a single observation, offered quietly, points to a corridor others walked past for a century. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten chambers are worth returning to, that these erased records still matter, that the shadows still deserve inspection. Because the Gilded Age did not disappear, it merely learned to disguise itself as legacy. So we close the register, not as an ending, but as a pause. The lamp is dimmed. The room returns to its controlled darkness. Somewhere beyond the shelves, the mansion's corridors stretch on, soundless, patient, lined with doors that appear ordinary, until one notices the locks were replaced, recent enough to look out of place, old enough to have gathered dust. And if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Another estate, another ledger, another missing line that will not explain itself. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. And still, the halls remember.